The heat over Palermo pressed down like a lid and made the afternoon shimmer. Via D'Amelio lay narrow between apartment blocks, laundry lines hanging still in the dusty light. Paolo Borsellino stepped out of the Alfa with the quick, clipped stride that had become a habit. He carried cigarettes and the weight of a city on edge. He had promised a short visit to see his mother. His escort fanned out automatically. 3 men to the front and 2 to the rear, eyes on windows, balconies, and parked cars. He reached for the entry bell. The bomb went off as his hand touched the metal. The stolen Fiat 126, parked at the curb, vanished upward in a white-orange column, and the street folded into noise. Glass scythed into stairwells. The pressure hit so fast that people did not hear the sound until after they felt it crush their chests. When the smoke thinned enough for shapes to return, there was a crater where the little car had been, and bodies under a fall of dust and paper. The smell of explosive hung over the block with the sweetness of burned plastic and upholstery. He had known it might end this way. 52 years old, the judge had carried his friend Giovanni Falcone's coffin only 57 days earlier, after the Capaci bombing tore a hole in the highway outside Palermo and in Italy's confidence. In the weeks between the funerals, he visited schools and courthouses and kept working the cases that mapped Cosa Nostra's reach into business, politics, and public contracts. He spoke quietly and smoked constantly. When he looked around a room, he seemed to calculate angles of danger without moving a single paper. He went nowhere without an escort, and yet he insisted on this visit. His mother still lived in that building. He would not stop being her son because the mafia wanted him afraid. On Via D'Amelio, the escort had done what training demanded. They had parked to block sight lines and stepped into the shield positions they had practiced 100 times. Agostino Catalano watched the balconies. Emanuela Loy checked the entrance. She had been the first woman assigned to an escort team in Sicily and became the first woman killed by the mafia. Vincenzo Limuli and Claudio Traina moved to cover. Walter Eddie Cosina held the rear. Antonio Vullo stayed in the second car, about to reposition, when the pressure wave lifted the vehicle and flung it against a wall. He lived because he had not yet opened his door. Neighbors poured into the street barefoot, stepping on glass without feeling the cut. Fire rolled along parked cars. Stair rails bent into ripples. Borsellino lay near the gateway he had been reaching for. Vullo, bleeding and dazed, crawled out and shouted for help that did not yet know where to run. Mothers called down from balconies and then realized their windows no longer existed. The echo of the explosion walked the block and kept walking. Sirens converged and brought the sound of the state back to the street. Firefighters fought the cars and the apartment blaze that had jumped a floor. Officers pushed back the crowd and tried to secure a scene that refused order. Doctors did what triage allowed. The stretch of road looked like the failings everyone knew too well had finally taken physical form. Weak sidewalks, walls patched and patched again, a civic skin stretched thin over fear. The investigators found what bombs always left, metal that told a story. The chassis of the small car carried its number. Twisted wire and fragments of a remote trigger remained. Someone had packed the trunk with a heavy charge and watched from a nearby window or rooftop, waiting for the target to cross an invisible line. The push of a thumb finished what terror had started months before. Behind the cordon, rumor moved faster than the official register. People asked about the red leather notebook the judge carried, his agenda rosa, where he kept thoughts too sensitive for typed memos. Some said they had seen it in the minutes after the blast, held by a uniform or a man in a suit, and then it was gone. Its disappearance entered the city's catalog of doubts and never left. Every unanswered question sprouted another. The funerals filled the cathedral with salt and fury. Banners spilled over railings. Thousands of Palermitans stood under the July sun, chanting that this time the state had to choose. The names of the dead rolled like an honor roll and a warning: Paolo Borsellino, Agostino Catalano, Emanuela Loi, Vincenzo Limuli, Claudio Traina, Walter Eddie Cosina. The city reminded itself that a single escort agent had lived, Vulo, a man with the bad luck to survive when his friends did not. Those who knew the judge remembered the years that led here. He and Falcone had worked out of the bunker courthouse, moving evidence like a long chess game. The Maxi trial cracked a piece of the mafia's armor and established that Cosa Nostra was a single hierarchical organization, not just rumor with 1,000 faces. Convictions followed. Retaliation followed the convictions. When the highway crater opened at Capaci in May, the country felt more than grief. It felt a deadline. He told friends that he lived in borrowed time and kept working anyway, as if the only answer to a threat was to finish the case that provoked it. The Via D'Amelio blast showed how far his enemies would go. The stolen car and the remote trigger belonged to the same toolbox that had taken down judges and priests and police chiefs before. But the precision here, timed to a family visit, detonated in a city street, stated an intent to humiliate, to say that nothing was safe, not even a mother's doorway. Families kept their children away from windows for weeks. Then the country moved. Parliament tightened laws, sped up confiscations of mafia assets, and gave prosecutors more teeth. The 41 bis regime hardened the isolation of top inmates. Citizens' groups filled squares with white sheets hung from balconies. In the weeks that followed, school children painted sheets with the word "No" hung from balconies, and Palermo's balconies bloomed white. Marches wound through the center with photos of Falcone and Borsellino held high like icons. Magistrates who had worked with them stood in court the next morning and read charges as usual, a plain ritual that felt like defiance. Parliament answered with emergency decrees, stronger asset seizures, and tougher witness protection. The 41 bis prison regime bit hard, sealing bosses in cells meant to cut every thread. Police pressure finally reached the door of Salvatore Riina in January 1993. Even then, the organization lashed out with bombs on the mainland, Florence, Milan, Rome, trying to terrify a nation into retreat. The trials that followed brought verdicts and also confusion. Years later, a collaborating mafioso described how the car had been prepared in a clandestine garage, how the order flowed from the top of the organization, and how the button had been pushed from a hidden vantage point. At the same time, the courts wrestled with earlier false confessions and misdirections that had compromised the first investigations. The word depistagio, derailment, entered legal language, and with it the sober knowledge that truth could be delayed and damaged before it arrived. Still, verdicts climbed the chain of command and fixed responsibility where it belonged. None of that brought back the quiet man who walked fast and smoked too much and tried to live inside the thin space between law and fear. The ruin on Via D'Amelio joined Italy's map of scars, a geography as real as mountains. Years turned. The family tended the garden planted where the crater had been. Every July, the street filled again, and the city measured how far it had come and how far it still had to go. The story of that afternoon refused to flatten into an easy lesson. It said that a system failed when the people who defended it were left to walk into predictable traps. It said that reform arrived late, and only because ordinary people demanded it in voices too many to ignore. On a hot day in Palermo, a judge rang a bell at his mother's building, and the mafia answered first. The echo traveled a long time, into courtrooms, parliaments, and classrooms, until it became a promise that the state would not step back again. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.